good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There is a particular quality to the world we are stepping into tonight. A world of mist on mountain passes, of ink brushed onto paper in silence before dawn, of armoured men on horseback crossing rice paddies in the rain, of courts so refined they had a word for the precise feeling of beauty tinged with sadness and impermanence, and of violence so institutionalized and so aestheticized that it became, over centuries, something approaching an art form. Tonight we are going to tell the story of feudal Japan, not just the samurai, though the samurai are here in full, not just the shoguns, though the shoguns are here too, and the stories of how they rose and fell and rose again are among the most dramatic in the political history of any civilization. We're going to tell the whole story. The farmers in their paddies, the merchants in their port cities, the monks on their mountain, the women whose lives the histories mostly forgot to record, and who were present in every corner of the world those histories described anyway. We're going to talk about what it actually meant to live in a society organised around hierarchy, honour, and the ever-present awareness of death. We are going to talk about a civilization that spent 700 years in various states of civil war and somehow, in the middle of all of it, produced some of the most refined aesthetic sensibilities the human world has ever managed. That combination, exquisite beauty and endemic violence, existing not in spite of each other but almost because of each other, is the central paradox of the world we're entering tonight, and it is worth holding in your mind as we begin. So before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. There is something I find genuinely moving about knowing that this story is drifting over different continents at the same moment. Some of you just ending a long day, some of you unable to sleep, some of you halfway between the two. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Let the room settle into something soft. Find a comfortable position and let the breath slow. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the beginning of a world that took centuries to fully become itself. Japan is an archipelago, 4 main islands and several thousand smaller ones, stretched in a curved chain along the eastern coast of Asia. And its geography shaped everything about its history, with an intimacy that continental civilizations rarely experience. The islands are mountainous. About 3/4 of Japan's landmass is too steep and rugged for cultivation, which means that the human population has always been concentrated in the coastal plains, the river valleys, and the narrow strips of flat land at the foot of mountain ranges. This compression of population into limited agricultural space created a particular kind of social pressure. Competition for productive land was fierce and constant, and the political structures that emerged over the centuries were shaped by the need to control and allocate the rice paddies that fed everyone. Rice was not merely a food in the Japan that we're entering tonight. It was the medium of exchange, the measure of wealth, the organisational principle of the agrarian economy, and the symbolic centre of religious practice simultaneously. A lord's wealth was measured not in coin, but in koku, units of rice, each roughly the amount needed to feed one person for a year. The productivity of a domain was expressed as so many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of koku. The stipends paid to samurai retainers were denominated in koku. The taxation that sustained the warrior class was extraction of a portion of the rice harvest from the farming communities below them. The entire feudal edifice, from the shogun at its apex to the hereditary foot soldier at its base, rested on the wet rice paddy and the labour of the men and women who worked it. Water surrounded the islands on all sides, and for most of Japan's history that water provided both protection and limitation. Protected, because any invasion required crossing a significant stretch of open ocean, a logistical challenge that deterred all but the most determined enemies. Limited, because the same ocean that kept invaders out also created a distinct psychological relationship with the outside world, a sense of the islands as a separate and complete world. one that chose its relationships with the mainland selectively and with considerable intentionality. China was close enough to matter enormously. Chinese writing, Chinese Buddhism, Chinese administrative models, Chinese art and poetry all crossed the water and were absorbed, adapted, and eventually transformed into something distinctly Japanese. Korea was the relay point through which many of these influences travelled. But Japan was never conquered by China, never colonized by it, never politically subordinate to it in the way that Korea periodically was. The influences flowed on Japanese terms, which meant they could be welcomed or rejected or modified as Japanese political and cultural needs dictated. The world that became feudal Japan had a long prehistory, before the systems we are here to discuss took their recognizable form. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, the Japanese archipelago was organized under the authority of a court centered in the Yamato region, the area around what is now Nara and Osaka, in the central part of Honshu, the main island. The Yamato rulers were the ancestors of the imperial family that still occupies the chrysanthemum throne today, making the Japanese imperial line the oldest continuously existing royal dynasty in the world, though the political power of that line has waxed and waned enormously across the centuries. In the early period, the Yamato court absorbed the wave of Chinese influence with remarkable energy and deliberateness. The Taika reform of 645 CE was an attempt to reorganize the Japanese state along the lines of the Tang Chinese administrative model, a centralized bureaucracy, a system of state-owned land distributed to cultivators who paid taxes in kind, a merit-based official class rather than purely hereditary aristocracy. The reform was ambitious, imperfectly implemented, and ultimately unsuccessful in its centralizing goals. But the attempt itself tells you something important about the aspirations of the early Japanese court and the seriousness with which Chinese models were taken. The capital was moved to Nara in 710 and to Kyoto, which the Japanese called Heiankyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, in 794. It would remain in Kyoto for over 1,000 years, until the Meiji Restoration of 1868, and the period of court culture centered on Heian is one of the most distinctive and influential in Japanese cultural history. The Heian period, running from 794 to 1185, was the great age of the court aristocracy, a world of extraordinary refinement, of poetry competitions and incense-blending contests, of elaborate seasonal rituals and the cultivation of mono-noa ware, that aesthetic sensitivity to the pathos of impermanence that would become one of the defining qualities of Japanese cultural life. The tale of Genji, written around the year 1000 by a court lady named Murasaki Shikibu, is generally considered the world's first novel and is certainly one of the most psychologically sophisticated works of literature produced in any culture before the modern period. Its world, of subtle courtship conducted through the composition and exchange of poems, of career advancement determined by aesthetic judgment as much as political calculation, of an aristocracy so refined that a gentleman's worth was measured partly by the elegance with which he could layer the colours of his robes, was genuinely the world of the Heian court, not an idealised fantasy of it. But the Heian court was not Japan. It was a small, brilliant and increasingly isolated world perched on top of a society it was losing the ability to govern. The administrative system established by the Taika reforms had been eroding for generations, as the great aristocratic families found ways to convert public lands into private estates, shun, that were exempt from taxation and outside the effective reach of central authority. As the tax base of the central government contracted, its ability to maintain order in the provinces contracted with it. And into that administrative vacuum, a new social class was beginning to emerge. The samurai did not spring fully formed from Japanese tradition. They evolved, over several centuries, from the armed retainers and military specialists that the great aristocratic families of the provinces used to protect their estates, enforce their claims against neighbours, and suppress the peasant uprisings that the pressures of the Shogun system periodically produced. The word samurai itself derives from a verb meaning to serve. These were, in origin, men who served. Their early equipment and techniques drew on Chinese and Korean traditions, as well as native Japanese ones. But over the centuries of the Heian period, the particular synthesis of heavy armour, the composite bow and mounted archery that became the defining image of the classical Japanese warrior, took its distinctive form. The bow was the primary weapon of the early samurai, not the sword. The great curved bow, the yumi, was a weapon of considerable technical sophistication, asymmetric in design to allow it to be used from horseback, laminated from wood and bamboo and bound with rattan and lacquer, in a construction that took skilled craftsmen months to complete. The art of mounted archery, kyujutsu, was the central martial skill of the early warrior, and the formal ceremonies and competitions around it were the social ritual through which the warrior class displayed its expertise and established its status. The sword, the katana in its later, most famous form, was present from the beginning, but it was a secondary weapon, the weapon you drew when the bear was exhausted or the fighting became too close for archery. The two great clans that would dominate the first great period of samurai political power were the Taira and the Minamoto, rival military families that had grown through generations of provincial service to the court aristocracy and that had accumulated enough independent power, wealth, and armed following to act as political entities in their own right. Their rivalry, which had been building through the middle decades of the 12th century, broke into open civil war in 1180 and consumed Japan for 5 years in a conflict known as the Genpei War, Gen being an alternate reading of the character for Minamoto, Pei an alternate reading for Taira. The war is the great epic moment of early samurai culture, the event that the later warrior tradition would return to repeatedly as a founding myth, a source of heroes and cautionary tales, a demonstration of the transience of power that Japanese Buddhist sensibility found both tragic and instructive. The Taira had been the dominant force at court through the middle of the 12th century, their leader Taira no Kiyomori effectively controlling the government through the manipulation of imperial succession and the placement of family members in key positions, a technique that the great court aristocracy, the Fujiwara, had been practicing for centuries, and that Kiyomori deployed with the same brazen confidence. The Minamoto, excluded from court power and scattered across the eastern provinces, were the insurgency. Their leader after the war began was Minamoto no Yoritomo, a man whose talent for political organisation exceeded his talent for battlefield command. He was rarely present at the decisive engagements of the war himself, but who understood with unusual clarity that military victory was only the first step in a more important process, the creation of a new institutional framework that would make Minamoto political dominance permanent rather than contingent. The war's most celebrated figure, however, was not Yoritomo, but his younger half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a warrior of extraordinary battlefield genius and tragic personal destiny, who became the central hero of the samurai literary tradition and who remains one of the most beloved figures in Japanese popular culture to this day. Yoshitsune won the decisive naval battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, catching the Taira fleet in a strait where the tidal current shifted at the crucial moment, allowing Minamoto ships to close and board. The last of the Taira were destroyed there. The child Emperor Antoku, 7 years old and the grandson of Kiyomori, was drowned in the sea by his grandmother, who leapt with him rather than submit to capture. The image of the young emperor entering the waves, held by an old woman who preferred death to defeat, became one of the defining icons of the samurai literary tradition, the Heike Monogatari, the tale of the Heike, which chronicled the rise and fall of the Taira with a poetic gravity and Buddhist melancholy that made it the Iliad of medieval Japan. Yoshitsune's reward for his victories was Yoritomo's suspicion. The half-brother who had won the war became the half-brother who threatened the political settlement that followed it. Yoshitsune was hunted, sheltered briefly by the northern lord Fujiwara no Hidehira, and eventually forced to die by suicide. Junshi, the ritual death performed to follow one's lord, in a northern fortress in 1189 when his protector's son, less loyal than his father, gave way to Yoritomo's demands. Yoshitsune's story, in its combination of martial genius and political victimization, its tragic arc from triumph to death, became the template for a certain kind of Japanese hero, the figure who excels beyond what the political world can accommodate and is destroyed by his own excellence. It is a template that Japanese literature and theatre would return to across the centuries, with a regularity that suggests something genuine about the culture's understanding of greatness and its costs. In 1185, Minamoto no Yoritomo established his government not in Kyoto, where the imperial court continued to exist, but in Kamakura, a small coastal town on the eastern side of Honshu, far from the court and close to the eastern provinces where Minamoto power was rooted. The political arrangement he created was called the Bakufu, literally tent government, the headquarters of a military commander in the field, a word that captures the essential self-presentation of the new regime, not replacing the emperor and the court, but administering the realm alongside them, providing the military governance that the elegant civilian aristocracy could not. The emperor remained, the court remained, the elaborate ceremonial and cultural life of Kyoto continued. But real political and administrative power resided in Kamakura, in the hands of the man who had received from the imperial court the title of Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, usually shortened to shogun, and who exercised that power through a network of military governors and estate stewards that reached into every province. The shogunate Yoritomo established is known as the Kamakura shogunate, and it lasted until 1333, nearly a century and a half of warrior government that transformed the institutional landscape of Japan in ways that could not be undone. The samurai class, which had been a service class in the Heian period, professional warriors in the employ of court aristocrats, became under the Kamakura system something closer to a governing class, holding administrative positions, collecting taxes, and administering justice in the provinces under the Bakufu's authority. The relationship was still expressed in the feudal language of service and loyalty, but the service now ran upward through military chains of command rather than to the civilian aristocracy of the court. Yoritomo died in 1199, thrown from a horse, or so the chronicles say, with a vagueness about great men's deaths that suggests political sensitivity around the circumstances. And the shogunate passed first to his sons and then, within a generation, into the hands of his wife's family, the Hojo. The Hojo regents, for that is what they were, regents who governed in the name of puppet shoguns who were themselves ruling in the name of emperors who nominally commanded the realm, represent one of the defining structural features of Japanese political culture, the consistent preference for indirect authority, for governing through a titular superior rather than claiming the supreme title directly. It is a pattern that repeats across Japanese history with a consistency that demands explanation. The Hojo never became shogun. Later figures who could have become emperor or shogun often chose not to. The political culture appeared to place particular value on the distinction between the person who held formal authority and the person who exercised actual power, a distinction that generated enormous complexity in the historical record, but that seems to have served important social functions in a culture where hierarchy was both sacred and practically necessary. The Hojo Regency produced one of the most important legal documents of the medieval period, the Goseibai Shikimoku of 1232, also known as the Formulary of Adjudications. It was a law code for the samurai class, specifying the principles by which disputes between warriors were to be resolved. Questions of inheritance, land tenure, the obligations of vassalage, the consequences of various types of misconduct. It was deliberately practical rather than philosophical, oriented toward the resolution of the specific disputes that warrior society generated in large numbers, and it was written in the clear, direct Japanese of administrative documents rather than the courtly Chinese that elite literary culture still employed. It was also notably more favourable to women than the legal cultures it operated alongside. Women under the Goseibai Shikimoku could inherit, hold property, and act as administrators of estates, a position that would erode significantly in the later feudal periods as the legal culture tightened around exclusively patrilineal inheritance. the Hojo Regency faced its greatest external challenge from an unexpected direction. In 1274 and again in 1281, Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of China and the greatest conqueror of his era, dispatched invasion fleets against Japan, the largest amphibious military operations in the history of the medieval world. The first invasion landed in northern Kyushu and fought a series of engagements against Japanese defenders before a storm forced the fleet to withdraw. The second invasion, launched with a far larger force, also landed in Kyushu and was destroyed, not primarily by Japanese military resistance, but by a typhoon of exceptional violence that struck the invasion fleet in the harbour and destroyed much of it within days. The Japanese called the storms kamikaze, divine winds, and interpreted them as evidence of celestial protection for the sacred islands. The mythology of Japan as a divinely protected land, which would be invoked at various points across the following 7 centuries, and which would acquire a terrible 20th century resonance in the name applied to the suicide pilots of the Pacific War, was crystallized and confirmed by the Mongol invasions and their dramatic endings. The Mongol invasions had a paradoxical effect on the political stability of the Hojo Regency. The military effort had been successful, but the nature of the victory, against a natural disaster rather than a defeated enemy, meant that there was no conquered territory to distribute among the warriors who had fought. The customary reward for military service was land or income rights. With no land gained, the Hojo had nothing to give the warriors who had defended the coasts. The warriors, many of whom had borrowed to equip themselves and were now in debt without prospect of reward, were not satisfied by gratitude alone. The financial and political strains generated by the unarguable victory over the Mongols paradoxically weakened the authority of the regime that had organised the defence. It is one of history's more elegant ironies. The greatest military success of the Kamakura period began the process that would eventually destroy the Kamakura shogunate. The fall of Kamakura in 1333 was accomplished through a political alliance as strange as any the medieval world produced. Emperor Go-Daigo, who had ambitious plans to restore direct imperial rule, to make the emperor not merely the symbolic apex of the political system, but its actual governing centre, raised an armed resistance against the Bakufu. The warrior Ashikaga Takauji, sent by the Bakufu to suppress the imperial uprising, defected to the emperor's side. Another warrior, Nita Yoshisada, attacked Kamakura from the east. The Hojo regent and his family died by suicide in a mass ceremony as the city fell, several hundred people dying together in a single act of collective self-destruction that was, in the context of samurai values, the appropriate response to irreversible defeat. The imagery of it, the fires, the bodies in orderly rows, the last formal ritual performed in the ruins of a world, is characteristic of a culture that had made death into a ceremony. Go-Daigo's restoration of direct imperial rule lasted approximately 3 years before it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. He had promised the warriors who supported him rewards that he could not deliver within a system organised around imperial estates and court offices rather than land grants. Ashikaga Takauji, who had delivered him the victory, found the rewards inadequate to his ambitions and his followers' expectations. In 1336, Takauji turned against Go-Daigo, drove him out of Kyoto, and installed a rival emperor on the throne. Go-Daigo retreated to the mountain redoubt of Yoshino, south of Nara, and established what he declared was the legitimate imperial court, the southern court. Takauji's emperor in Kyoto was the northern court. Japan had 2 emperors simultaneously, which was theologically impossible and politically messy, and the situation persisted for over 50 years before the southern court was persuaded to acknowledge the northern court's legitimacy in 1392. The period is called the Nanbokucho, the era of the northern and southern courts, and it ran concurrently with the early period of the Ashikaga shogunate that Takauji established in Kyoto. The Ashikaga shogunate, which ruled Japan from 1336 to 1573, had a different character from its Kamakura predecessor. Where Kamakura had been geographically and culturally separate from the imperial court, a warrior capital in the east, self-consciously provincial in its aesthetic values, deliberately distinguished from the courtly refinement of Kyoto, the Ashikaga shoguns set up their government in Kyoto itself, and threw themselves into courtly culture with an enthusiasm that transformed both institutions. The Ashikaga were great patrons of the arts. The third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who ruled from 1368 to 1394 and continued exercising power behind his son until his death in 1408, built the Kinkaku-ji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, on the northwestern edge of Kyoto, covering its upper stories in gold leaf, surrounding it with a lake and garden designed for aesthetic contemplation, and using it as both a private retreat and a statement about his position at the intersection of warrior power and courtly culture. He also reopened formal trade relations with China, relations that had been severed by the Mongol conflict, and used the revenue from that trade to fund the cultural patronage that made his court the centre of the arts in Japan. The cultural achievements of the Ashikaga period are by any measure extraordinary. The No Theatre, the austere, slow-moving, deeply Buddhist theatrical form that uses masks, elaborate costume and minimal movement to create an experience that operates at the boundary between performance and ritual, reached its classical form under the playwright and performer Ziami Motokyo, who worked under Yoshimitsu's patronage and wrote the theoretical texts that still govern No practice today. Ziami's concept of Yugen, the mysterious, profound beauty that lies beneath the surface of things, felt rather than seen, suggested rather than stated, is one of the most important aesthetic ideas in Japanese culture, and one that shaped every subsequent Japanese art form to some degree. The tea ceremony, chado, the way of tea, developed from the informal tea-drinking practices of Zen Buddhist monasteries into the elaborate aesthetic ritual codified by the tea master Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century, a practice that distilled the values of wabi, the beauty of imperfect, impermanent, incomplete things, into a social ritual of extraordinary precision. The ink painting tradition, suibokuga, that Japanese artists developed from Chinese models produced in the work of Sesshu Toyo and his contemporaries, landscapes of a sparing, suggestive power that make European oils of the same period look, by comparison, almost cluttered with information. Zen Buddhism deserves particular attention in any account of samurai culture because the relationship between Zen practice and warrior identity was not incidental but structural. Zen, the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese Chan, itself a transliteration of the Sanskrit dhyana, meaning meditation, emphasized direct experience over textual study, the sudden illumination of satori over the gradual accumulation of doctrinal knowledge, and the use of paradoxical koans, unanswerable questions like the famous "what is the sound of one hand clapping?" to break the rational mind's habitual patterns and forge a more immediate relationship with reality. For the samurai class, which lived with the constant proximity of death, and needed a psychological framework that allowed it to function effectively in the face of that proximity, Zen's emphasis on presence, on the complete inhabitation of the immediate moment, on the transcendence of the fear of death through the cultivation of equanimity, was practically useful as well as spiritually compelling. The Zen monasteries of the medieval period were not merely religious institutions. They were centres of Chinese learning, of art, of administrative expertise, of the kind of disciplined intellectual culture that the warrior class needed access to if it was going to govern as well as fight. The political history of the Ashikaga period is not, in its later phases, a story of order and governance. It is a story of progressive fragmentation and civil war that culminates in the most destructive period in Japanese history, the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, which consumed Japan for roughly a century and a half, beginning in the mid-15th century. But before that final collapse, it is worth pausing on the regional lords who shaped the Middle Ashikaga period, because the great daimyo of the Sengoku era did not emerge from nowhere. They were products of provincial political cultures that had been developing across the Muromachi period, accumulating land, retainers, and the institutional habits of regional governance that the Civil War then weaponized. The Wasugi of Echigo in the north, the Takeda of Kai in the mountains of central Honshu, the Imagawa of Suruga on the eastern coast, these were the great houses whose power the Sengoku reshuffled with such violence, and whose military and administrative innovations shaped the armies that Nobunaga, Hideyoshi and Ieyasu later commanded. Takeda Shingen and Wasugi Kenshin deserve particular mention because their rivalry, a series of battles fought over nearly 2 decades at Kawanakajima, on the plain below the mountains of Nagano, produced some of the most celebrated military engagements in Japanese history, and because both men represent the most sophisticated expression of Sengoku daimyo governance before the final unification changed everything. Shingen built his domain's power partly through military excellence and partly through an administrative reform, the Kanami, the essential system, that reorganized his domain's tax collection, infrastructure maintenance, and military obligation into a coherent system capable of sustaining long campaigns. His flood control works along the Kamanashi River in Kai Province were engineering achievements that protected the most productive agricultural land in his domain and were maintained for generations after his death. His famous aphorism, "The wind, the forest, the fire, the mountain," taken from Sun Tzu and used as the Takeda battle standard, is in modern Japan one of the most recognizable emblems of the Sengoku period. Wasugi Kenshin, the Lord of Echigo on the Japan seacoast, was a man of a different but equally compelling character. Deeply religious, a devotee of the Bishamonten, the Buddhist deity of war, who reportedly refused to profit from the salt trade that his coastal position would have made lucrative, instead supplying salt to his inland enemy Shingen, when the Imagawa attempted a trade embargo against the Kai domain. Whether or not the story is entirely accurate, Japanese historical tradition has a way of improving on its heroes. It captures something about the chivalric dimension of Sengoku warfare that coexisted with its brutality. The sense that the great commanders of the period inhabited a moral world with its own codes and expectations that were not merely cynical window dressing on naked power competition. The 5 battles of Kawanakajima between 1553 and 1564 produced no decisive outcome. They were fought over strategic position and territorial advantage in a long-running rivalry that ended not with victory for either side, but with Shingen's death from illness in 1573, while on campaign toward Kyoto. Kenshin survived him by 5 years, dying in 1578, reportedly of a stroke while in the bathroom, an ending that was so undramatic relative to the life that preceded it that several later traditions insisted he must have been assassinated. The Onin War of 1467 to 1477, which began as a dispute over the Ashikaga shogunal succession and became a general conflict between the great warrior families that had been building their autonomous power in the provinces, effectively destroyed Kyoto. The fighting took place in the streets and districts of the capital. Temples and palaces burned. The civilian population fled. The city that had been the centre of Japanese court culture for 7 centuries was reduced in large areas to burned-out ruins inhabited by desperate refugees. After the Onin War, central authority essentially ceased to exist. The Ashikaga shoguns continued to reside in Kyoto and to issue documents under the shogunal seal, but their actual political authority extended no further than the immediate vicinity of the capital. Power in the provinces was exercised by the daimyo, the great lords, a word that becomes so central to the story of the Sengoku period that it is worth pausing on. Daimyo had existed before the Sengoku period as a general term for great landholders, but the Sengoku daimyo were something new. Rulers who had established autonomous territorial control over defined geographical areas through military force, who administered their domains, maintained their own armies, collected their own taxes, made their own laws, and conducted their own foreign policy, in negotiation or conflict with other daimyo rather than in submission to any central authority. They were, in the framework of comparative history, something very like sovereign rulers, though the concept of sovereignty as European political theory formulated it was not available to them, and they would have expressed their position differently. The process by which the Sengoku daimyo emerged is one of the most dramatic stories in Japanese social history, because it involved the systematic destruction of an existing aristocratic order. The great families that had dominated provincial society in the Kamakura and early Ashikaga periods, the Shugodaimyo, the military governors, were overthrown in domain after domain by their own subordinates. The process was called Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high, and it was one of the defining features of the Sengoku world. Men of relatively modest origin who possessed military talent, administrative ability, and the political intelligence to bind followers to them through a combination of reward and shared identity, seized power from their social superiors with a frequency that would have been unimaginable in the more rigidly hierarchical world of the earlier medieval period. The Sengoku period was, among many other things, a violent meritocracy, or perhaps more accurately, a violent marketplace in which the competitive advantages that survival required were military and administrative effectiveness rather than hereditary status. The lives of ordinary people during the Sengoku period were shaped by the constant reality of military conflict in ways that make the comfortable aesthetic achievements of the Ashikaga court seem, in retrospect, like the product of a world that was already gone by the time those achievements were being celebrated. Peasant communities in contested territories faced the double burden of taxation by whatever lord claimed their domain and the depredations of passing armies that requisitioned food, labour and materials with or without the formality of compensation. The practice of karita rozeki, the violent harvesting of crops from enemy territory as a military tactic, meant that rice paddies, the economic foundation of the entire feudal system, were deliberately destroyed as instruments of war. Villages in the path of campaign routes were burned routinely. The distinction between soldiers and civilians was observed selectively, when it was observed at all. And yet the villages survived. The farming communities of Japan demonstrated across the Sengoku period a remarkable capacity for collective organisation and self-protection that is one of the under-examined features of the era. Village communities, mura, developed their own internal governance structures, their own dispute resolution mechanisms, their own collective agreements with the overlords who claimed their taxes. In some regions, peasant communities organised armed self-defence forces, ji-samurai or farmer samurai, that were capable of resisting small military units and of negotiating the terms of their submission to larger ones. The Ikki movements, leagues of rural communities or warrior groups that organised around shared interests and occasionally produced sustained armed uprisings against their overlords, demonstrated that the political agency of the lower orders was not extinguished by the military dominance of the daimyo class, even if it was severely limited by it. The Iko-Ikki, the leagues of followers of the true Pure Land Buddhist sect Jodo Shinshu, were the most dramatic example, a peasant religious movement that established effective autonomous rule over the province of Kaga from 1488 to 1580. Governing through the organisational structure of the local Buddhist temple network, and that the greatest military commanders of the 16th century found extremely difficult to suppress. The three figures who ended the Sengoku period are among the most fascinating in Japanese history, because they represent three different answers to the same question. How do you unify a country that has spent a century tearing itself apart? Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, three men who came to power in sequence, each building on what the previous one had achieved, and who between them accomplished one of the most remarkable political transformations in the history of any country. Oda Nobunaga is the most dramatically compelling of the three, the figure who seems to have stepped out of a different kind of story than the one surrounding him. He was born in 1534, the son of a minor daimyo in Owari province, a small domain in central Honshu with no special advantage of location or resources, and he came to power through a combination of military innovation, strategic aggression, and a psychological hardness that contemporaries found genuinely alarming. His early reputation was for erratic, almost theatrical behaviour. He was known as the Fool of Owari, a young man who wore his clothes askew, ate while walking in the streets, associated with commoners and generally violated every norm of aristocratic dignity that the samurai code prescribed. The reputation was partly accurate and partly deliberate. Nobunaga was using apparent unpredictability as a political tool, making himself difficult to categorize and therefore difficult to plan against. The battle that announced his arrival as a major figure was Okazama in 1560, where he defeated the vastly larger army of Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo of the period, in a surprise attack during a rainstorm that caught the Imagawa forces bivouacked in a narrow valley. Nobunaga had perhaps 2,000 men against Yoshimoto's 25,000, and he attacked anyway, in conditions that prevented the Imagawa from deploying their superior numbers effectively. Yoshimoto was killed in the initial assault, apparently taken by surprise to the point that he initially thought the commotion near his camp was a brawl among his own troops. The battle was decisive, the victory complete, and the strategic consequence was transformative. Nobunaga had eliminated the obstacle that had been constraining his expansion to the east, and demonstrated that audacity could substitute, at least occasionally, for numbers. What followed over the next 2 decades was a campaign of unification, aggressive, systematic, and occasionally brutal, that brought the central provinces of Japan under Nobunaga's control. He took Kyoto in 1568, installing Ashikaga Yoshiaki as the 15th Ashikaga shogun, but making clear from the beginning that the shogunate was a political instrument in his hands, rather than an independent authority. When Yoshiaki attempted to build a coalition against him, Nobunaga expelled him from Kyoto in 1573, effectively ending the Ashikaga shogunate without bothering to formally abolish it. He was not interested in the title of shogun himself. He was interested in control. Nobunaga's military innovations were substantial and historically significant. He was among the first Japanese commanders to deploy firearms. The arquebus, introduced to Japan by Portuguese traders in 1543, on a large scale and in a tactically sophisticated way. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he positioned approximately 3,000 arquebusiers behind wooden palisades, and used a rotating volley system to maintain continuous fire against the charging cavalry of the Takeda clan, cavalry that was considered the finest in Japan, and that had never before been effectively countered on the battlefield. The Takeda cavalry was destroyed. The battle is often cited as one of the decisive demonstrations of early modern firepower superiority over medieval cavalry tactics, comparable in its implications to battles like Crécy in Europe, though historians have debated how novel and how systematic Nobunaga's tactics actually were, as against the simplified version preserved in later tradition. His suppression of the Iko-Iki was the most brutal aspect of his campaigns, and the one that has generated the most historical controversy. The warrior monks and peasant fighters of the true Pure Land sect had their main stronghold at Ishiyama Honganji, a fortress temple in what is now Osaka, and resisted Nobunaga's forces for 10 years before a negotiated withdrawal in 1580. The suppression of the related Iki stronghold at Mount Hiei, the great Tendai Buddhist complex northeast of Kyoto that had its own political and military dimensions, involved in 1571 the burning of hundreds of temple buildings and the killing of thousands of people, monks, families, and the civilian population of the settlements on and around the mountain. The scale of the destruction was deliberately shocking, and was intended to communicate something specific, that Nobunaga's campaign recognized no sacred or institutional exception to his authority. The great temples of medieval Japan had been quasi-independent political actors for centuries. He was telling them that era was over. Nobunaga was assassinated in June 1582 at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, in circumstances that have been argued over ever since. Whether Mitsuhide acted from personal grievance, from political calculation, from a coalition with other rivals of Nobunaga, or from some combination of all three, is not definitively established by the available evidence. What is established is that Nobunaga died in the burning temple, killing himself as it collapsed around him rather than allowing capture, and that within 13 days, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had avenged him by defeating Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki and positioning himself as Nobunaga's political successor. Toyotomi Hideyoshi is the most improbable figure in Japanese history. He was born in 1537 to a peasant family in Owari. His father was a foot soldier, a non-samurai, and had no hereditary claim to any position in the warrior hierarchy. He entered Nobunaga's service at some point in the late 1550s, reputedly as a sandal carrier, and rose through the military administration by sheer ability. His physical appearance was striking enough to be noticed even in sources that were trying to be polite about it. He was short, slight, and had an unusually elongated, thin face that earned him the nickname Saru, the monkey, which was apparently used to his face, and apparently used by him about himself, which tells you something about both his appearance and his personality. In a society where appearance was closely correlated with status, and where the warrior ideal was physical imposing, Hideyoshi's ascent from peasant sandal carrier to ruler of Japan through the raw force of his abilities represents one of the most extreme cases of social mobility in any pre-modern society anywhere. He completed the unification that Nobunaga had begun, subduing the remaining independent daimyo through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill. He was a more flexible political operator than Nobunaga, more willing to incorporate defeated enemies into his coalition rather than simply destroying them, and his campaigns in the 1580s and early 1590s brought the island of Shikoku, the island of Kyushu, and the last holdout of the Hojo clan in the east under his authority. By 1590, Japan was unified for the first time in over a century. What Hideyoshi did with that unification is a story of extraordinary policy innovation, alongside catastrophic strategic overreach. The sword hunt of 1588 ordered the confiscation of weapons from the peasant population, a measure with both practical and symbolic dimensions. Practically, it reduced the capacity of peasant communities to organise armed resistance, and created a clearer distinction between the military class, which retained weapons, and the farming class, which did not. Symbolically, it was a step toward the formalisation of the social hierarchy that the Sengoku period's fluid violence had temporarily suspended. The swords collected were to be melted down to make nails and bolts for a great statue of the Buddha, a framing that combined practical policy with a gesture toward the religious legitimation of social order. The separation of the farmer and warrior classes that the sword hunt began was continued in Hideyoshi's cadastral surveys, which registered every cultivated plot in Japan, determined its productivity, and assigned each farming family to the land it worked. The surveys had obvious fiscal utility. They also had the effect of fixing the farming population in place. Once you were registered as a farmer on a specific piece of land, the legal and practical framework made it very difficult to become anything else. Hideyoshi's invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597 were the catastrophic miscalculation that mars the otherwise impressive record of his unification policies. His stated goal was the conquest of China. Korea was to be the route through which Japanese armies would march to the Ming dynasty's capital. And while this ambition was not unique in the scope of its delusion, it was pursued with sufficient military force to cause tremendous suffering, without coming remotely close to achieving its objectives. The first invasion force crossed the Korea Strait in 1592 with roughly 160,000 men and advanced rapidly across the Korean peninsula, capturing both Seoul and Pyongyang within a few months. Then the Ming Chinese intervened with a substantial army. The Korean admiral Yi Sun-sin, one of the most brilliant naval commanders in East Asian history, used his fleet of turtle ships, ironclad or at least iron-armoured warships of his own design, to devastate Japanese supply lines at sea, cutting the invasion force off from its logistical base in a series of naval engagements that rank among the most decisive of the 16th century. The Japanese armies in Korea gradually lost the initiative, were pushed south, and eventually agreed to a ceasefire after inconclusive negotiations. The second invasion in 1597 was no more successful. Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving instructions that the armies return home. His dream of continental empire died with him, leaving behind it a devastated Korean peninsula, a complicated set of political relationships with China and Korea that would not be resolved for centuries, and a domestic situation in which a group of regents had been appointed to govern Japan until Hideyoshi's young son Hideyori came of age. The head of those regents was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was 60 years old in 1600, when the final battle for control of Japan took place at Sekigahara, on the plain where several main roads converged in central Honshu. He had spent a long career. He had been one of Nobunaga's allies since the 1560s, and then one of Hideyoshi's, in patient accumulation of resources, relationships, and strategic position, waiting with a self-discipline that his contemporaries remarked on, and that later Japanese cultural tradition would make into a kind of legend. The famous saying attributed to him captures something real about his character and his method. If the bird will not sing, wait for it to sing. Where Nobunaga's version was that he would force the bird to sing, and Hideyoshi's was that he would cajole it into singing, Ieyasu's patience was his defining quality and his greatest strategic asset. Sekigahara pitted the Tokugawa coalition, the eastern lords, daimyo who had chosen to back Ieyasu, against the western coalition assembled by Ishida Mitsunari, one of Hideyoshi's senior administrators, who was trying to hold the Toyotomi alliance together against Tokugawa ambition. The battle itself was decided in a few hours, partly by military action and partly by the defection of Kobayakawa Hideaki and his substantial force from the western coalition to the eastern one at a critical moment in the fighting, a defection that Ieyasu had apparently negotiated in advance, which is either evidence of exceptional political intelligence or just good luck, and is probably both. The western coalition collapsed. Ieyasu mopped up resistance across the country over the following years, finally destroying the Toyotomi remnant at the siege of Osaka Castle in 1614 to 1615, where Hideyoshi's son Hideyori died in the falling castle, burned, or by his own hand, the sources disagree, and the last obstacle to Tokugawa supremacy was removed. In 1603, Ieyasu had received from the emperor the title of shogun, the first time the title had been held by a Tokugawa, and the beginning of a dynasty that would hold it for 265 years. 2 years later, he arranged for his son Hidetada to be named shogun, demonstrating to every daimyo in Japan that the Tokugawa intended to hold the position dynastically rather than personally. The lesson of the Sengoku period was clear. The Ashikaga had lost power because their authority over the daimyo had weakened. The Tokugawa were going to make sure that could not happen to them. The system the Tokugawa built over the decades following Sekigahara was one of the most elaborate mechanisms of political control ever devised for a pre-modern society, and it achieved its primary objective, the preservation of Tokugawa power and the prevention of civil war, with remarkable completeness for 2.5 centuries. The system's key elements deserve careful attention, because they shaped not just the political history of the Edo period, but the texture of daily life for every person in Japan during those years. The Sankin-kotai system, alternate attendance, required every daimyo to spend alternating periods of time in their home domain and at the Tokugawa capital in Edo, which is now Tokyo. When a daimyo was in his home domain, his family remained in Edo as hostages. When he was in Edo, the expense of maintaining a household appropriate to his status in the capital city drained his resources. The system served multiple purposes simultaneously. It kept the daimyo's families under Tokugawa supervision, it prevented the accumulation of the kind of financial reserves that would be necessary to fund a rebellion, and it created a road system, the 5 great highways that connected Edo to the rest of Japan. That was itself a major economic development. The daimyo processions travelling between their domains and Edo were elaborate ceremonial affairs, thousands of men in disciplined formation, their equipment and the scale of the procession calibrated exactly to the lord's rank. The roads required were built, the way stations established, the infrastructure created, all because the political requirement of alternate attendance demanded continuous movement of large groups of wealthy people across the country. The rigid social hierarchy that the Tokugawa codified divided Japanese society into four main classes beneath the shogun and the daimyo: the samurai, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. The ordering was deliberate and philosophically grounded in the Confucian social theory that the Tokugawa administration adopted as its ideological framework. Farmers came second because they produced the rice that sustained society. Artisans third because they made useful things. Merchants last because they produced nothing of value themselves but merely moved goods that others had produced. A Confucian contempt for commerce that had interesting practical consequences given how commercially sophisticated Japanese society actually was. Outside the four main categories were the outcast communities: the eta, who performed ritually impure work involving the slaughter of animals and the handling of corpses, and the hainin, vagrants and performers, who occupied the margins of the legal and social order in ways whose cruelties were systematic and whose effects were long-lasting. The boundaries between these classes were, in theory, rigid and hereditary. You were born into the class your parents occupied, and you remained there. In practice, the boundaries were permeable in various ways that the official ideology preferred not to acknowledge. Prosperous merchants bought samurai status for their sons through the adoption system or through financial arrangements with cash-strapped samurai families. Impoverished samurai quietly took up commerce. The distinction between artisan and farmer was unclear in rural communities, where the same household might make tools in the winter and farm in the summer. But the ideology of rigid hierarchy served important political functions, even when its description of social reality was imprecise, because it naturalized inequality and made social ambition, the desire to rise above one's station, morally suspect rather than socially admirable. The story of the 47 Ronin, the Akko incident of 1701 to 1703, is the single most celebrated example of samurai loyalty and collective action in Japanese cultural history, and the fact that it occurred during the Edo period, under the Tokugawa peace, tells you something important about what the samurai class had become and what it needed to believe about itself. The Lord Asano Naganori, daimyo of the small domain of Akko, drew his sword inside Edo Castle, an act strictly forbidden by Tokugawa law, and wounded a court official named Kira Yoshinaka, who'd reportedly been insulting and humiliating him over a period of weeks. Asano was immediately ordered to commit ritual suicide. His domain was confiscated. His retainers became ronin, masterless samurai, from a word meaning wave man, adrift without anchor. 47 of those ronin, under the leadership of the chief retainer Oishi Yoshio, spent a year and a half in elaborate deception. Oishi himself apparently took to drink and debauchery in Kyoto, frequenting the pleasure quarters so openly that Kira's agents, who were watching him, concluded that he had accepted his lord's death with humiliating passivity and abandoned any thought of vengeance. Then on a winter night in December 1702, the 47 assembled, attacked Kira's compound in Edo, found him hiding in a storage shed, and killed him. They carried his severed head to the grave of their lord at Sengakuji Temple and placed it there before turning themselves in to the authorities. The Tokugawa government faced a genuine dilemma. The 47 had followed the samurai code of loyalty and vengeance to its logical conclusion, doing exactly what the warrior ethos prescribed. They had also broken the law against vendetta, and the lord whose death they had avenged had been punished for a clear legal violation. After months of deliberation, the government ruled that they should be permitted to die by ritual suicide, seppuku, rather than being executed as criminals. They died with ceremony and were buried at Sengakuji alongside their lord. The temple became immediately, and has remained, a place of pilgrimage. The Akko incident was dramatized almost immediately into the kabuki and bunraku puppet theatre forms as the Chushingura, the treasury of loyal retainers, with the names and settings changed to a different historical period to avoid the political complications of depicting a recent event involving real people. The Chushingura has been performed continuously since 1748 and has been adapted into films, television dramas, novels and manga with a frequency that makes it the most performed story in Japanese dramatic history. Its appeal is not difficult to understand. It is a story about loyalty, about the cost of integrity, about the assertion of human values against a bureaucratic system that finds those values inconvenient. In the Japan of the Tokugawa peace, where samurai values were ideological rather than operational, the 47 Ronin demonstrated that the ideology was real, that there were men who would pay the ultimate price to enact what the warrior code demanded rather than merely profess it. That demonstration was precious to a class that was not otherwise being given many opportunities to prove its own seriousness. Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694 and transformed the 17-syllable haiku from a form of comic-linked verse into the vehicle for some of the most concentrated lyric poetry in any language, deserves more than a passing mention because his life and work are as revealing about the Edo period as any political or institutional history. He was born into a samurai family of modest means in Iga province, studied poetry from an early age, and eventually made his way to Edo, where he became a poetry teacher and developed the aesthetic theory of haiku that would define the form. He lived simply, his first residence in Edo, a small hut near the Sumida River, where a banana plant, a basho, grew in the garden and gave him the pen name he adopted, and travelled extensively, the wandering journeys that produced his greatest prose poetry works. The narrow road to the deep north, completed in 1694, the year of his death, describes a journey through the northern provinces of Honshu, Tohoku and the Japan Sea coast, undertaken partly as a pilgrimage to famous poetic sites, partly as a continuation of the Zen practice of travel as spiritual discipline, and partly as the work of a poet who understood that the landscape he was moving through was not merely physical but literary, layered with the associations of previous poets who had walked the same roads and written about them. The result is a work in which the physical journey and the poetic tradition are inseparable, where a crumbling castle wall or a temple gate or a stretch of sea cliff carries within it the accumulated meaning of every poem that has described it before and every season that has passed over it since. Basho's famous frog poem, The Old Pond, A Frog Jumps In, the Sound of Water, is not a description of a frog. It is a poem about presence and impermanence and the way that a single concrete moment can open onto something much larger, and it has never needed more than 17 syllables to do all of that. The haiku form that Basho perfected embodied the Zen aesthetics of the warrior tradition in a literary medium accessible to the entire literate population, which in the Edo period, with its extensive network of temple and domain schools, was considerably larger than in any previous period. The literacy rate in Edo period Japan, estimated at around 40% of the male population and somewhat less for women by the late 18th century, was among the highest in the world at the time, and was a direct product of the institutional infrastructure that the Tokugawa peace had made possible. The stable domain administration required literate samurai, and the schools established to produce literate samurai also served the children of wealthy commoners who aspired to the cultural attainments that literacy opened. The result was a reading public for the literature, the theatre, the woodblock prints, and the popular fiction, the shabon, the kibyoshi, the yomihon, that the Edo period produced in abundance. The samurai of the Edo period faced a problem that earlier generations had not had to confront. They were a warrior class in a country at peace. The 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule were, by the standards of what had come before, extraordinarily peaceful. There were no major civil wars, there were no foreign invasions, there were uprisings, famines, and various local crises, but the catastrophic multi-decade military conflicts that had defined Japanese history from the Genpei War through the Sengoku period were over. The samurai retained their swords and their social privileges and their legal right to kill commoners who showed disrespect, a right called kirisute gomen that was less frequently exercised in the Edo period than its existence in law might suggest, but that was present as a legal reality and as a social fact throughout. What they largely did not have was war. The response to this structural problem was the development of Bushido, the way of the warrior, as a formal philosophical and ethical system. The codification of samurai values into an explicit code was, paradoxically, largely a product of the Edo period, when those values needed to be articulated and transmitted in the absence of the battlefield experience that had previously transmitted them. Yamaga Soko in the 17th century and Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century, whose conversations were compiled into the Hagakure, the text that contains the famous phrase that the way of the samurai is found in death, were theorists working in peacetime, reflecting on what the warrior identity should mean in a world without warfare. The Hagakure's central argument, that the samurai must live as if already dead, must make the decision about death before entering any situation, so that the fear of death never clouds judgment or compromises action, is a meditation on the meaning of the samurai life produced precisely at the moment when that life was most thoroughly disconnected from the actual experience of combat. The samurai who spent the Edo period in their lord's castle towns, because the rural military presence that had characterized earlier periods had been replaced by the urbanization of the warrior class into castle towns under Hideyoshi and the early Tokugawa, had administrative, ceremonial and intellectual functions. They managed the domain's bureaucracy. They performed the elaborate rituals of the lord's household. They studied the military arts, swordsmanship, archery, spear technique, horsemanship, as aesthetic and spiritual disciplines rather than as practical preparation for combat that was likely to occur. The great sword schools, the Ito Ryu, the Yagyu Shinkaye Ryu and others, developed their techniques and their philosophical frameworks in the Edo period. Miyamoto Musashi, the most celebrated swordsman in Japanese history, wrote the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, in the early 17th century as a meditation on strategy and the martial mind that has been read as a guide to business and competitive practice in the modern world, which he could not have anticipated but would probably have found peculiar rather than flattering. The castle towns, jokamachi, that grew up around the great daimyo castles across Japan were the primary urban form of the Edo period. They housed not only the samurai retainers and their families, but the artisan and merchant communities that served the domain's economic needs and the castle's administrative ones. They were deliberately planned settlements in many cases, with the samurai quarters separated from the townspeople's neighbourhoods, the chonin districts, in ways that maintained the social hierarchy in spatial terms. The castles themselves were extraordinary engineering achievements, the great tenshu or main towers, rising on massive stone foundations, surrounded by moats and baileys and nested defensive circuits, combining the practical requirements of military architecture with the aesthetic requirements of a class that had decided to make beauty inseparable from power. Himeji Castle, which survives in nearly original condition and is among the finest examples of Japanese castle architecture in existence, gives some sense of what the full achievement looked like. White plastered walls gleaming above the stone foundation, the main tower and subsidiary towers arranged in a silhouette of refined complexity, the entire composition simultaneously a military fortification and an aesthetic object of considerable sophistication. The urbanization of the Edo period produced, somewhat against the expectations of the Tokugawa ideologues who had placed merchants at the bottom of the social hierarchy, an urban commercial culture of remarkable vitality. Edo itself grew from a small fishing town at the time of Ieyasu's arrival in 1590 to a city of perhaps 1 million people by the early 18th century, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than London or Paris or any city in Europe. Osaka, the commercial capital, was the great hub of the national rice market and of the mercantile networks that moved commodities across the country. Kyoto remained the centre of craft production, particularly silk textile production, and of the cultural institutions, the imperial court, the great Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, that connected the Edo period to the longer history of Japanese civilization. The chonin culture that developed in these cities, the culture of the townspeople, the merchants and artisans, was one of the most energetic and creative phenomena of the period, and it produced art forms that are now among the most recognizable expressions of Japanese culture worldwide. Kabuki theatre, which developed in the early 17th century initially from performances by women, quickly banned by the Tokugawa government on grounds of public morality, and then by young men, also eventually banned, before settling into the all-male form it has maintained ever since, was the great popular theatre of the shonen class. Its aesthetic was deliberately extravagant: elaborate costumes, dramatic makeup, spectacular stage effects, plots that combined history, romance, and melodrama in a style that the refined No aesthetic would have found vulgar, and that the Edo townspeople found irresistible. The woodblock print, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, developed as a commercial art form serving the entertainment culture of the Edo period cities. Prints depicting famous actors, famous courtesans, landscapes, erotic scenes, and the various pleasures of the urban pleasure quarters circulated widely and cheaply through the cities, and were collected with enthusiasm by the townspeople who could not afford painted originals. The pleasure districts that the Tokugawa government officially licensed, the Yoshiwara in Edo, the Shimabara in Kyoto, the Shinmachi in Osaka, were carefully controlled spaces where the sex trade was concentrated, regulated, and taxed. The logic of the licensed quarter was characteristically Tokugawa. The activity was acknowledged as something that would occur regardless of prohibition, so it was better to channel it into a defined space where it could be supervised and where it would generate revenue rather than trying to suppress it ineffectively. The women who worked in the quarters, the courtesans, the geisha, who were specifically entertainers rather than sex workers, though the distinction was not always clean in practice, occupied a social position that was simultaneously degraded and curiously elevated. The most accomplished courtesans of the licensed quarters were celebrities of a kind, famous for their beauty, their artistic accomplishments, and their conversation, celebrated in woodblock prints and in the fiction of the period. Their social world was a kind of inverted version of ordinary society, where the usual hierarchies of class and gender were temporarily suspended in the space of the licensed district, and where a wealthy merchant could command the company of a woman whose aesthetic cultivation exceeded his own. It was not a flattering arrangement for the women who lived it, but it was a culturally productive one in ways that shaped some of the most enduring images of Japanese aesthetics. The Tokugawa shogunate's relationship with foreign influences was one of the defining features of the period, and one of its most consequential policies, the transformation from the relative openness of the 16th century, when Portuguese and Spanish traders and Christian missionaries had established significant presences in Japan, when tens of thousands of Japanese had converted to Christianity, when Japanese traders ranged across Southeast Asia in substantial numbers, to the near total isolation of the Sakoku period, was not a sudden decision, but a process that extended across the first decades of the Tokugawa regime. Christianity was the primary target of the closing policy. The Tokugawa, and before them Hideyoshi, had become alarmed by the growth of Christian communities in Japan, communities that owed allegiance to a foreign religious authority, the Pope, and that included the possibility that Christian daimyo might seek alliances with Christian European powers against the shogunate. The suppression of Christianity began under Hideyoshi, with the execution of 26 Catholic missionaries and Japanese converts in Nagasaki in 1597. It intensified dramatically under the early Tokugawa shogunate, culminating in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, when a largely Christian community on the Shimabara Peninsula in Kyushu, pushed to the limit by the extraordinary tax burdens of a particularly rapacious local lord, rose in armed rebellion and held out in the ruined castle of Hara for nearly 4 months against a government force of more than 100,000 men. When the castle fell, the entire population, approximately 37,000 people, including the women and children who had sheltered there, was killed. The Shimabara Rebellion was the last major armed uprising of the early Edo period, and the government's response to it completed the suppression of Christianity and accelerated the closing of Japan to foreign contact. The Sakoku Edicts of the 1630s established the framework of restricted foreign contact that would govern Japan until 1853. The Portuguese were expelled entirely, their trade permanently ended. The Spanish had already been excluded. The English had withdrawn voluntarily when their trading post proved unprofitable. Of the European nations, only the Dutch were permitted to continue trading with Japan, and they were confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour, a fan-shaped piece of ground connected to the city by a single guarded bridge, where a small Dutch community of traders lived under close supervision and conducted the limited commerce the shogunate permitted. Japan was not entirely closed. The Dutch trade continued. The Chinese were permitted to trade in Nagasaki, and the Ryukyu Kingdom, now Okinawa, and the Ainu people of Hokkaido maintained relationships with Japan through intermediary domains. Japanese fishermen who were blown off course by storms were sometimes treated with extraordinary harshness when they made contact with foreign lands and were repatriated. The isolation was not absolute, but it was substantial, and it shaped Japanese society for over 2 centuries in ways that both preserved and distorted its development. The Dutch at Dejima were required to provide the shogunate with annual reports on world events. The Oranda Fusetzugaki, that gave the Tokugawa government a filtered but real window onto the outside world throughout the period of closure. Japanese scholars who studied Western science and medicine through Dutch books and Dutch contacts, a discipline known as Rangaku, Dutch learning, maintained a thread of engagement with European intellectual developments that meant Japan was not as completely ignorant of Western developments as the official ideology of Sakoku might suggest. The doctors and scientists who worked in the Rangaku tradition understood, by the early 19th century, enough about Western medicine, anatomy, astronomy, and military technology to know that the gap between Japan and the Western powers was real and growing. The question was whether the political system that had preserved Japanese autonomy would allow the changes necessary to close that gap before it became decisive. The social texture of Edo period Japan is worth dwelling on, because the 2.5 centuries between the establishment of the shogunate and its end were not merely a period of political stasis, but of social, economic, and cultural transformation that quietly undermined the foundations of the Tokugawa order even as that order appeared externally stable. The rural economy was changing in ways the shogunate's tax policies could not fully track. The commercialization of agriculture, the production of cash crops like cotton, indigo, and tobacco for sale in urban markets, rather than purely of rice for subsistence and tax payment, created rural prosperity in some regions and commercial networks that operated independently of the domain economy the Tokugawa had designed. The urban economy was producing a class of wealthy merchants whose financial resources dwarfed those of many samurai and some lesser daimyo, but whose legal status remained at the bottom of the official hierarchy. The contradiction between economic reality and legal status was not invisible to the people who lived within it. The currency of the social contract between the Tokugawa and the samurai class, the bargain by which the samurai surrendered political ambition in exchange for hereditary status and stipends, was gradually devalued by the economic pressures of the later Edo period. Many samurai stipends, fixed in rice, lost real value as the monetized economy made rice-denominated wealth less useful than it had once been. Samurai families found themselves in financial arrangements with the merchant class that the official ideology described as their social inferiors, borrowing money from Osaka merchants, selling their names and their daughters to merchant families eager for social respectability. The fictional clarity of the 4-class hierarchy was being eaten away from below by the commercial dynamism that peace and internal order had made possible. The currency of the social contract between the Tokugawa and the samurai class, the bargain by which the samurai surrendered political ambition in exchange for hereditary status and stipends, was gradually devalued by the economic pressures of the later Edo period. Many samurai stipends fixed in rice, lost real value as the monetized economy made rice-denominated wealth less useful than it had once been. Samurai families found themselves in financial arrangements with the merchant class that the official ideology described as their social inferiors, borrowing money from Osaka merchants, selling their names and their daughters to merchant families eager for social respectability. The fictional clarity of the four-class hierarchy was being eaten away from below by the commercial dynamism that peace and internal order had made possible. Before we leave the world of the Edo period's daily life, it is worth dwelling on a group whose presence runs through every aspect of the story we have been telling, and whose experiences the standard narrative most consistently neglects. Women in feudal Japan occupied positions that varied so enormously across class and period that generalization is almost misleading, but certain patterns emerge that deserve attention. The women of the warrior class in the earlier feudal periods, the Kamakura and early Ashikaga, had property rights that later generations of Japanese women would envy. The Goshibai Shikimoku of 1232 that gave samurai women inheritance rights was not maintaining a tradition, but responding to a reality. In a world where men went to war and frequently did not come back, women managed estates, directed retainers, and made the administrative decisions that kept household economies functioning. Tomoe Gozen, who fought in the Genpei War as a mounted warrior and is described in the Heike Monogatari as a woman of great beauty and exceptional martial ability, may be partly legendary, but she stands for a reality. The early medieval period produced women who exercised genuine power through the management of warrior households in ways that the later, more rigidly Confucian period systematically foreclosed. The movement away from women's property rights began in the Kamakura period itself and accelerated through the Muromachi and Sengoku periods as the adoption of Chinese Neo-Confucian gender ideology provided intellectual justification for what was partly a straightforward response to the demographic reality of endemic warfare. In a society where warrior households needed to maintain the legal clarity of succession to manage the military obligations that generated their income, the simplicity of patrilineal inheritance was practically attractive regardless of its justice to women. By the Edo period, the ideal of the samurai wife was articulated in texts that circulated widely among the warrior class. She was to be loyal, frugal, patient, and entirely subordinate to her husband and his family. She managed the household in his absence, which, given the Sankin Kotei system's requirement of alternate attendants in Edo, was frequent, but her management was administrative rather than proprietary. The property was his and would pass to his sons. The women of the commoner class had somewhat different lives, defined more by the rhythms of agricultural or artisan labour than by the ideological prescriptions of the samurai class. In farming households, women worked alongside men in the fields and gardens, managed the household economy, participated in the collective community structures, the village associations, the religious confraternities that organised rural life and occasionally led or participated in the Ikki uprisings that punctuated the Edo period. The weaving and textile industries that were essential to the Japanese economy depended heavily on women's labour, both in the silk production of the rural households, where silk thread was produced, and in the weaving establishments of Kyoto and other textile centres. The women who worked in the pleasure quarters were drawn primarily from the poorest rural families, sold into service as children by parents who could not otherwise survive a failed harvest or an exceptional tax demand. A system of exploitation so structurally embedded in the economy of the period that contemporary sources rarely commented on it as unusual, though individual voices occasionally expressed something that reads like discomfort or compassion. The literature that women produced in the Edo period was extensive, largely overlooked by subsequent scholarship until relatively recently, and sometimes remarkably candid about the experience of lives lived within these constraints. The haiku poets Kaga no Chiyo and Tagami Kikusha wrote within the same tradition that Basho had established, but with a perspective shaped by female experience. Kaga no Chiyo's most famous poem, about her son who died young, catching the particular quality of maternal grief in 17 syllables with a directness that later male commentators tended to sentimentalize into something more decorous than the original. The women writers of the Heian period had set a standard that the Edo period's more restrictive gender ideology made difficult to match, but that was not for want of the desire to write or the ability to do so. The Buddhist institutions of the feudal period deserve their own careful attention, because they were not merely spiritual organizations but major economic, political, and intellectual forces whose interaction with the warrior class shaped both. Japan by the medieval period had accumulated several major Buddhist schools: Tendai, Shingon, Jodo, Jodo Shinshu, Zen in its several lineages, and Nichiren, each with its network of temples, its institutional culture, its relationship to the imperial court and the warrior class, and its theological tradition. The great temple complexes, Ryakuji on Mount Hiei, Kofukuji in Nara, Todaiji with its colossal bronze Buddha, were not merely places of worship but landholders of the first rank, employers of thousands of monks and monastery servants, operators of temple markets and pilgrimage infrastructures, and occasional military powers who maintained armed forces of monk soldiers, the Sohei, who enforced the temple's political interests with a directness that the theoretical otherworldliness of Buddhism might not have seemed to imply. The relationship between Zen Buddhism and the samurai class that we touched on earlier had specific institutional expressions. The Rinzai school of Zen, which emphasized the koan as a tool of sudden enlightenment, and which came to Japan in a more Chinese-influenced form than the later Soto school, was particularly closely associated with the military aristocracy of the Kamakura and Ashikaga periods. The 5 great Zen temples of Kamakura and the 5 great Zen temples of Kyoto, the Gosan, or 5 mountain system, were the intellectual and cultural centres of the period's highest culture, producing painters, poets, and scholars alongside monks. The abbot of a great Gozan temple was a figure of considerable political importance, a diplomatic resource in relations with China, a source of cultural legitimacy for the shoguns who patronized the temples, and an intellectual authority whose opinions on matters beyond the strictly spiritual were solicited and taken seriously. The practice of Zen tea culture, which began in the monasteries as the use of tea to maintain wakefulness during long meditation sessions, and was gradually elaborated into the social and aesthetic ritual we recognize as chado, illustrates how the feudal world's most distinctively Japanese cultural contributions emerged from the intersection of imported tradition and native transformation. Tea had come from China. Zen had come from China. But the particular synthesis of Zen aesthetics, Japanese materials, the wabi sensibility, and the specific social arrangements of the warrior household produced something that was not Chinese and could not have been Chinese, a ritual whose every element was chosen for its embodiment of values that were specifically Japanese in their combination. The rough clay of the tea bowl imperfect and unique, the seasonal flowers in the alcove exactly right and never to be repeated, the conversation calibrated to the moment, the whole proceeding conducted with an attention to aesthetic detail that was simultaneously an expression of Buddhist mindfulness and a social performance of refinement. The peasantry expressed its dissatisfactions through a steady rhythm of local uprisings, hyakusho iki, that increased in frequency across the later Edo period. These were not typically revolutionary movements aiming at the overthrow of the feudal system. They were negotiations conducted through the medium of collective violence over tax rates, domain policies, and the behaviour of local officials. The standard form of a hyakusho iki involved the gathering of large numbers of peasants from a district, the presentation of a written petition of grievances to the domain lord or his representatives, and the implicit or explicit threat of continued disorder if the petition was not addressed. Domain governments typically responded with a combination of concession, adjusting the policies complained of, and punishment of the identified leaders who could expect exile or execution as the price of having led a successful negotiation. The system was genuinely dysfunctional as an arrangement for addressing social grievances, but it functioned as one, in a way that allowed accumulated tension to be periodically discharged without building to the revolutionary threshold. The intellectual life of the Edo period was, given the political constraints on certain kinds of expression, surprisingly rich and varied. Neo-Confucianism, particularly the Jusi school adopted as the Tokugawa's official ideology, produced generations of scholars and administrators educated in the philosophical tradition that the regime used to justify its social hierarchy and its political arrangements. But Neo-Confucianism also produced, through its emphasis on careful textual study, a tradition of philological scholarship that eventually undermined the Chinese intellectual framework it had begun from. The Kokugaku movement, national learning, developed in the 18th century as a reaction against the Chinese and Buddhist intellectual traditions that had dominated Japanese scholarship, advocating a return to the Japanese literary and religious classics, to the Manyoshu poetry anthology, and the Kojiki mythological record as the authentic expression of Japanese spiritual identity. Moturi Norinaga, the greatest scholar of the Kokugaku tradition, spent 35 years producing a commentary on the Kojiki that was simultaneously a work of extraordinary philological precision and a romantic nationalist argument about the unique and superior quality of Japanese civilization. The Kokugaku movement's emphasis on Japanese uniqueness, on the divine origins of the imperial line, and on the alien character of the Chinese and Buddhist traditions that had shaped Japanese culture for a millennium, was politically subversive in ways that would only become fully apparent in the 19th century. The crisis that ended the Tokugawa shogunate came from outside the islands in a form that the Sakoku policy had been designed to prevent and had ultimately only postponed. On July 8, 1853, 4 American naval vessels under Commodore Matthew Perry entered Edo Bay and anchored off the town of Uraga within sight of the capital. The ships were steam-powered, a technology that Japan had not developed, and they were armed with cannon of a caliber and range that the shore defences could not have matched. Perry carried a letter from the American president demanding that Japan open its ports to American ships for trade and for the resupply of whalers and other vessels operating in the Pacific. He departed after delivering the letter and promised to return with more ships the following year for the answer. The shock to Japanese political society was profound. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had based its claim to legitimate authority partly on its ability to maintain the national security arrangements that kept Japan safe, was confronted with the demonstration that those arrangements had become militarily inadequate. The foreign barbarians that the policy of Sakoku had been designed to exclude had arrived in vessels that could not be excluded, carrying weapons that the shogunate's forces could not counter, and making demands that the shogunate could neither accept, without humiliation, nor refuse without the risk of military conflict it was not equipped to win. The political crisis that resulted, the debate over how to respond to Perry's demands, the fracturing of the daimyo consensus that had sustained the Tokugawa order for 2.5 centuries, the revival of the imperial institution as an alternative source of political legitimacy, was the beginning of the end of the feudal period. The shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa with the Americans in 1854 and the Harris Treaty in 1858, opening several ports to American trade and granting American citizens extraterritorial legal rights in Japan, an arrangement similar to what Western powers had imposed on China after the Opium War, and one that Japanese observers correctly identified as a symptom of national weakness rather than a diplomatic achievement. Similar treaties followed with Britain, France, the Netherlands and Russia. The unequal treaties, as they came to be known, were experienced by politically conscious Japanese as a national humiliation, and the experience of humiliation drove the political mobilization that transformed the country. The slogan of the movement that coalesced against the Tokugawa in the late 1850s and 1860s was Sono Joy: revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The two halves of the slogan pointed in somewhat different directions. Revering the emperor meant restoring direct imperial rule, which meant ending the shogunate that had displaced it. Expelling the barbarians meant reversing the opening of Japan to Western contact, which meant rejecting the unequal treaties. The more pragmatic participants in the movement eventually recognized that expelling the barbarians was impossible without the military modernization that would require engaging with the West rather than excluding it. But the slogan served its political purpose. It provided an ideological framework within which opposition to the Tokugawa could be organized, and in which the imperial court in Kyoto could serve as an alternative center of loyalty for the samurai domains of the south and west. Above all, Choshu and Satsuma, the two great domains whose warriors and leaders drove the Meiji Restoration. The Boshin War of 1868 to 1869 ended with the defeat of the Tokugawa forces and the restoration of the Meiji Emperor to direct rule. The last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, surrendered his authority with a dignity that the circumstances made genuinely impressive. Edo Castle was surrendered without the bloodbath that many had feared. Yoshinobu retired to Shizuoka, took up photography and cycling in his later years, activities that connect him to the modernity that was replacing the world he'd represented, and died in 1913, the last person to have held the title of shogun, outliving the feudal system he had embodied by 4.5 decades. What the feudal period left behind is embedded so deeply in Japanese culture that listing its legacies risks making them seem like historical curiosities rather than the living substance of a civilization. The martial arts, kendo, judo, aikido, karate in its Okinawan form, are direct descendants of the samurai training traditions, formalized in the Meiji period and after into codified sports and disciplines, but carrying within their forms and their philosophies the values and the physical knowledge of the warrior tradition. The tea ceremony, practiced in precisely the form that Senno Rikyu codified in the 16th century, continues to be an important cultural practice and a substantial industry of teaching, schools and equipment. No and kabuki continue to be performed. The woodblock print tradition, ukiyo-e, shaped the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who encountered Japanese prints in the second half of the 19th century, and through them the entire subsequent history of Western visual art. The aesthetic categories that the feudal period elaborated, wabi, sabi, yugen, mono-no-aware, the beauty of impermanence and incompleteness, have proven remarkably exportable, finding audiences in the modern world that the medieval poets and tea masters who developed them could not have anticipated. The social hierarchies of the feudal period left marks that proved more durable than the political system that had enforced them. The discrimination against the communities descended from the outcast Eta class, now called burakumin, persisted in social practice and in marriage markets long after legal discrimination was formally abolished in the Meiji period and remains a social reality in parts of Japan today. The Confucian emphasis on hierarchical relationships between lord and retainer, parent and child, husband and wife, elder and younger, was carried into the modern period in forms that shaped the organizational culture of Japanese corporations, schools, and institutions in ways that are still distinctly visible. The samurai tradition's influence on Japanese national identity in the modern period is a complicated story. The Meiji Restoration, which ended the feudal period politically, simultaneously promoted samurai values: loyalty, self-sacrifice, discipline, the subordination of the individual to the group, as the virtues of the modern Japanese nation. The Bushido philosophy that had been elaborated in the Edo period was repackaged in works like Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1900 in English, and addressed primarily to Western readers, as an argument that Japan had its own tradition of chivalric virtue comparable to the Western version, and that Japanese modernization was therefore not Westernization, but the continuation of native values in new forms. The repackaging was politically useful. It was also historically selective in ways that the medieval warriors who practiced the actual arts of war, with their pragmatism, their political flexibility, and their tendency to change sides when strategic advantage dictated, would have found puzzling. The tragedy of the way that samurai values were instrumentalized in the 20th century, the militarist government's use of Bushido rhetoric to encourage suicidal resistance during the Pacific War, the kamikaze pilots who flew into American ships under a banner that inverted the divine wind mythology of the Mongol invasions, was not the fault of the feudal period that had generated those values. It was the result of their extraction from the social context that had given them meaning, and their injection into a modern industrial warfare that the medieval samurai would not have recognized as the same kind of thing at all. The culture that had produced the Hagakure and the Gorin no-sho and the aesthetic refinement of the tea ceremony had done so in a world where death was physically proximate, individually experienced, and socially contained within rituals and relationships that gave it meaning. Industrial war removed all of those conditions and retained only the injunction that death was not to be feared. The physical remnants of the feudal world are scattered across Japan with a density that makes the country one of the great historical landscapes of the world. Himeji Castle, the finest surviving example of Japanese castle architecture, rises above the city of Himeji in Hyogo Prefecture in a silhouette that has barely changed since the early 17th century. Matsumoto Castle in Nagano Prefecture, its black lacquered exterior reflected in the moat, is another, the combination of military architecture and aesthetic intention made visible in the same building. The great Shinto shrines of Nikko, built to enshrine the memory of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and decorated with the elaborate, almost overwhelming ornamental carving of the early Edo period, are a different kind of monument, the feudal aesthetic at its most self-consciously magnificent. The rock garden of Ryoanji in Kyoto, 15 stones arranged in raked gravel, in a composition whose meaning has been debated for 5 centuries without resolution, is perhaps the most compressed expression of the Zen aesthetic that shaped the interior life of the samurai tradition. The torii gates of Fushimi Inari Shrine, standing in their hundreds on the path up the mountain, each donated by a merchant or a corporation in an exchange of piety for commercial blessing that runs from the medieval period to the modern one without interruption, connect the world of the feudal merchants who funded temple complexes as both religious duty and social display to the world of Japanese businesses that do essentially the same thing today. The villages of the Shirakawa-go Valley in Gifu Prefecture, with their Gasho Zukuri farmhouses, the steeply pitched thatched roofs shaped like hands pressed together in prayer, designed to shed the heavy mountain snowfall, give a physical sense of what the agricultural communities of the feudal period actually looked like, the material reality of the farming life that supported the entire edifice of castle, court, and ceremony. They are UNESCO World Heritage Sites now and carefully preserved, but they were ordinary working farmhouses for centuries before they became objects of historical reverence. And the families that lived in them were the same families who paid the rice taxes and endured the military campaigns and organised the hyakushoiki and planted and harvested the rice that fed everyone. The literature of the period is among the richest in world culture. The Manyoshu Poetry Anthology, compiled in the 8th century, is the oldest collection of Japanese poetry and contains works by people of every social rank: emperors, courtiers, soldiers, and frontier guards far from home. The tale of Genji and the Pillow Book of Seishonagon stand as monuments of Heian court culture. The Heike Monogatari and the Taiheiki chronicle the violence of the medieval period with a Buddhist understanding of impermanence that transforms the record of battles and deaths into something approaching philosophy. The great haiku masters of the Edo period, Matsuo Basho above all, whose Okuno Hosomichi, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, is one of the finest travel writings in any language. A prose poem about a journey through the northern provinces of Japan that is simultaneously a meditation on time, memory, the natural world, and the meaning of the poetic vocation, produced a body of work that transformed the brevity and precision of the 17-syllable haiku form into a vehicle for insights that continue to land with unexpected force in the minds of readers who encounter them centuries after their composition. The frog jumps into the old pond. The sound of water. Nothing else needs to be said, and nothing has been left out. The ritual of seppuku, usually rendered in English as harakiri from the less formal reading of the same characters, deserves some careful attention because it was one of the most distinctively Japanese cultural practices of the feudal period, one that has been exoticized and misunderstood more consistently than almost any other aspect of the samurai world. Seppuku was ritualized suicide by self-disembowelment, performed with a short blade, the tanto, in a specific manner and according to specific protocols that varied by period and by the rank and circumstances of the person performing it. It was not, in the popular Western imagination, a casual or frequent practice. It was a formal act reserved for specific circumstances, when a warrior had been defeated and wished to die by his own hand rather than an enemy's, when a warrior had failed his lord in a way that could only be expiated by death, when a warrior was ordered by his lord or by the authorities to die as a form of execution, an execution that preserved the dignity of the condemned by allowing him to perform the act himself rather than submitting to the public violence of a headsman. The kaishakunin, the assistant who stood ready to decapitate the person performing seppuku at the moment the tanto entered the abdomen, ending the process before the worst of the physiological consequences could manifest, was not a mercy killing in the modern sense. He was a necessary participant in the ritual, responsible for ensuring that the act was performed with the dignity the occasion demanded. The cultural significance of seppuku went beyond its practical function as a mode of death. It was a demonstration that the samurai's most fundamental commitment to face death without flinching, to maintain composure under the worst of circumstances, to exercise the will even at the moment when the body was betraying it, was genuine rather than rhetorical. A warrior who died badly, who screamed, who flinched, who displayed fear in any visible form, had failed the most important test his culture set for him. A warrior who died well confirmed everything the warrior code claimed about itself and about him. The witnesses who attended a seppuku were there precisely to observe, and later to report on how it was done, ensuring that the public record of a warrior's death served the same function as the public record of his achievements in battle. The dying was the last performance, and it was taken as seriously as any other. The practice of junshi, following one's lord into death by suicide when the lord died, was periodically practiced across the feudal period, but was formally prohibited by the Tokugawa government in 1663 after the death of the daimyo Nabeshima Katsushige, following which 13 retainers committed suicide in the old fashion. The prohibition was not sentimental. The Tokugawa found the practice politically inconvenient because it removed experienced administrators from service at the moment when orderly succession was most important, and because it created the impression that loyalty ran to individual lords rather than to the Tokugawa system as a whole, an impression that the Tokugawa, understandably, preferred to discourage. The prohibition was largely observed, which tells you something about the effectiveness of Tokugawa authority, though individual acts of junshi continue to occur at the death of particularly revered lords. General Nogi Maresuke, who commanded Japanese forces in the Russo-Japanese War, and who killed himself along with his wife on the day of the Meiji Emperor's funeral in 1912, was performing what was understood by many Japanese as an act in the junshi tradition, following his emperor into death, maintaining the old loyalty with an anachronistic completeness that struck his contemporaries as both deeply admirable and deeply disturbing. Moriogai wrote a short novel about Nogi almost immediately afterward that remains one of the most searching meditations in Japanese literature on the relationship between the feudal past and the modern present. The Japan that emerged from the feudal period into the Meiji era was not simply a new Japan built on the ruins of an old one. It was a Japan that had spent 7 centuries developing the institutional habits, the aesthetic sensibilities, the patterns of social organisation, and the cultural reflexes that it carried into modernity, and that continued to shape it there in ways that made Japanese modernity recognisably Japanese rather than simply a local variant of Western industrial civilization. The capacity for collective organisation and disciplined execution that made Japanese industrialization so rapid, the aesthetic traditions that continue to inform Japanese design and craft production, the hierarchical sensibilities that shape the organizational culture of Japanese corporations and institutions, the relationship to impermanence and to the present moment that Buddhist and Shinto practice had elaborated across the medieval centuries. All of these were products of the feudal world, carried across the threshold of 1868 into a transformed context where they found new applications without losing their essential character. The samurai class was legally abolished in the Meiji period. The wearing of swords in public was prohibited in 1876. The samurai stipends were converted into government bonds and then phased out. The rigid four-class system was dissolved in favour of a modern legal equality of citizenship. But the men who made the Meiji Restoration, the leaders of the Choshu and Satsuma domains, the architects of modern Japanese institutions, were themselves samurai, products of the feudal education system, carriers of the feudal value system, translating those values into the new institutional language of nation-states, conscript armies, and industrial economies. The Meiji Restoration was not the end of the samurai tradition. It was the tradition's final, most radical adaptation, the transformation of feudal loyalties and values into the ideology of a modern nation preparing to take its place among the great powers of the world. The wheel of Japanese history had turned through the Genpei War and the Kamakura Shogunate, through the Nanbokucho period and the Ashikaga cultural flowering, through the Sengoku chaos and the Three Unifiers, through the long Tokugawa peace and the slow erosion of the order it had built, and into the modern world that replaced it. And at every turn, something was carried forward. The rice paddies that had sustained the entire structure from the beginning were still there. The mountains that had shaped the geography and the military geography and the aesthetic geography of Japanese civilization were still there. The awareness of impermanence, that all things end, that the cherry blossom falls after a week, that the warlord who commanded 10,000 men at dawn might be dead by evening, and that this impermanence is not a problem to be solved, but a quality of existence to be apprehended with clear eyes and quiet heart, was still there. That awareness is perhaps the deepest inheritance of the feudal world, and it is the one that translates most directly across the centuries and across the cultural distance between medieval Japan and the world you're inhabiting tonight. The Japanese had a name for it. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, the gentle sadness that comes from recognizing that everything beautiful is beautiful partly because it will not last. It was not despair. It was something more like the quality of attention that comes when you stop expecting permanence and simply look at what is actually there. The night is settling in around you now, and the long story of feudal Japan has reached its end, or the end of the part of it we can tell in a single night. 7 centuries of rice paddies and castle walls and ink on paper and swords in the rain. 7 centuries of men who organised their lives around the idea of dying well, and of women whose names the histories forgot but whose work sustained everything those histories recorded. 7 centuries of civil wars and aesthetic refinements existing in the same world, sometimes in the same person, sometimes in the same moment. The castles are still there, the rock gardens are still there, the mountain passes where armies march through the mist are still there. The haiku are still there, their 17 syllables carrying more silence than words, which was always the point. Let that settle into the quiet around you now. The mountains of Japan are dark tonight, and the rice paddies are still and silver in whatever light is falling on them, and somewhere in all of it, in the careful arrangement of stones in raked gravel, in the weight of a sword in a museum case, in the particular angle of light on the plaster walls of a castle above a city that is sleeping, the feudal world is still visible, still present, not as history, but as the shape that time has left in a place that spent 7 centuries learning how to be itself. Rest easy.